Hello. I always go live for a little bit on my TikTok to remind people that this is happening, especially because today is not a typical day. And I got caught up talking because I never go live on TikTok. I really need to do that more often. Okay. Hi. What's going on? Should I turn on the light? Ew, I look gross. Oh, maybe we aren't gonna have a light. How does that look? Disgusting? Awesome. Love it. Okay. We're in a new corner. We've never done it over on my desk before. Let's see how it goes. Yeah, what's up? Today we're reading chapter 6, which is when Eddie Cochran dies. And we also meet Mike Hanlon. Well, we've already met. We haven't met him. But yeah, like a child, Mike Hanlon. And we get to see his first year. That's really exciting. I've been looking forward to this a lot all day today because we missed the live last Saturday. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about that. I have it on my calendar right here that I'm supposed to do it. I just completely forgot. So, yeah, I'm so sorry about that. Hopefully I'll remember this Saturday. Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm glad you all are here. I see someone came over from TikTok. That's great. It's nice to have everyone. These videos will also, of course, be transferred into actual videos on my channel, so you can always go back and reference if you have to leave or something. So with that, I think we should just get. I'm hoping this isn't a wrap. Let's see how it goes. Alrighty. We're on page 251 for people following along in their books. Yeah. This is, at least in my copy, it's page 251. I have the paperback movie cover. So, chapter 6. One of the Missing, A Tale from the Summer of 58. 1. They weren't all found. No, they weren't all found. From time to time, wrong assumptions were made. 2. From the Derry News, June 21st, 1958, page 1. These are quotes from newspapers. Missing boy prompts new fears. Edward L. Cochran of 73 Charter Street, Derry, was reported missing last night by his mother, Monica Macklin, and his stepfather, Richard P. Macklin. The Cochran boy is 10. His disappearance has prompted new fears that Derry's young people are being stalked by a killer. Mrs. Macklin said the boy had been missing since June 19th, when he failed to return home from school after the last day of classes before summer vacation. When asked why they had delayed over 24 hours before reporting their son's absence, Mr. and Mrs. Macklin refused to comment. Police Chief Richard Borton also declined comment, but a police department source told the news that the Cochran boy's relationship with his stepfather was not a good one, that he had spent nights out of the house before. The source speculated that the boy's final grades may have played a part in the boy's failure to turn up. Derry School Superintendent Harold Metcalf declined to comment on the Cochran boy's grades, pointing out they are not a matter of public record. I hope the disappearance of this boy will not cause unnecessary fears, Chief Borton said last night. The mood of the community is understandably uneasy, but I want to emphasize that we log 30 to 50 missing person reports on minors each and every year. Most turn up alive and well within a week of the initial report. This will be the case with Edward Cochran, God willing. Borton also reiterated his conviction that the murders of George Dembrow, Betty Ripson, Cheryl LaMonica, Matthew Clements, and Veronica Grogan were not the work of one person. There are essential differences in each crime, Borton said, but declined to elaborate. He said that local police, working in close cooperation with the Maine State Attorney General's office, are still following up a number of leads. Asked in a telephone interview last night how good these leads are, Chief Borton replied, "Very good." Asked if an arrest in any of the crimes were expected soon, Borton declined comment. From the Derry News, June 22nd, 1958, page 1. Court order surprise exhumation. In a bizarre new twist to the disappearance of Edward Cochran, Derry District Court Judge Erhart K. Moulton ordered the exhumation of Cochran's younger brother Dorsey late yesterday. The court order followed a joint request from the county attorney and the county medical examiner. Dorsey Cochran, who lived with his mother and his stepfather at 73 Charter Street, died of what was reported to be accidental causes of May of 1957. The boy was brought into the Derry Home Hospital, suffering from multiple fractures, including a fractured skull. Richard P. Macklin, the boy's stepfather, was an admitting person. He stated that Dorsey Cochran had been playing on a stepladder in the garage and had apparently fallen from the top. The boy died without recovering consciousness 3 days later. Edward Cochran, 10, was reported missing late Wednesday. Asked if either Mr. or Mrs. Macklin was under suspicion of either the younger boy's death or the older boy's disappearance, Chief Richard Borton declined comment. From the Derry News, June 24, 1958, page 1. Macklin arrested in beating death under suspicion in unsolved disappearance. Chief Richard Borton of the Derry Police called a news conference yesterday to announce that Richard P. Macklin of 73 Charter Street had been arrested and charged with the murder of his stepson, Dorsey Cochran. The Cochran boy died in Derry Hospital of reported accidental causes on May 31st of last year. The medical examiner's report showed that the boy was badly beaten, Borton said. Although Macklin claimed the boy had fallen from a stepladder while playing in the garage, Borton said the county medical examiner's report showed that Dorsey Cochran was severely beaten with some blunt instrument. When asked what sort of instrument, Borton said, "It might have been a hammer. Right now the important thing is the medical examiner's conclusion that this boy was struck repeated blows with some object hard enough to break his bones. The wounds, particularly those in the skull, are not at all consistent with those which might be incurred in a fall. Dorsey Cochran was beaten within an inch of his life and then dumped off at the home hospital emergency room to die." Asked if the doctors who treated the Cochran boy might have been derelict in duty when it came to reporting either on an incident of the child abuse or the actual cause of death, Borton said they will have serious questions to answer when Mr. Macklin comes to trial. Asked for an opinion on how these developments might bear on the recent disappearance of Dorsey Cochran's older brother Edward, reported missing by Richard and Monica Macklin 4 days ago, Chief Borton answered, "I think it looks much more serious than we first supposed, don't you?" From the Derry News, June 25th, 1958, page 2. Teacher says Edward Cochran often bruised. Henrietta Dumont, who teaches 5th grade at Derry Elementary School on Jackson Street, said that Edward Cochran, who has now been missing for nearly a week, often came to school covered with bruises. Mrs. Dumont, who was one of Derry's 2 5th grade classes, since the end of World War II, said that the Cochran boy came to school one day about 3 weeks before his appearance, with both eyes nearly closed shut. When I asked him what had happened, he said his father had taken him up for not eating his supper. When asked why she had not reported a beating of such obvious severity, Mrs. Dumont said, "This isn't the first time I've seen such a thing as this in my career as a teacher. The first few times I had a student with a parent who was confusing beatings with discipline. I tried to do something about it. I was told by the assistant principal, Gwendolyn Rayburn, in those days to stay out of it. She told me that when school employees get involved in cases of suspected child abuse, it always comes back to haunt the school department at tax appropriation time. I went to the principal and he told me to forget it or I would be reprimanded. I asked him if a reprimand in a matter like that would go on my record. He said a reprimand did not have to be on a teacher's record. I got the message. Not a thing anymore. For the record. Asked if the attitude in the Derry school system remained the same now, Mrs. Dumont said, "Well, what does it look like in light of this current situation? And I might add that I would not be speaking to you now if I hadn't retired at the end of this school year." Mrs. Dumont went on, "Since this came out, I got on my knees on every night and pray that Eddie Cochran just got fed up with the beast of a stepfather and ran away. I pray that he reads the paper or hears on the news that Macklin has been locked up. That when he reads in the paper or hears on the news that Macklin has been locked up, Eddie will come home." In a brief telephone interview with Monica Macklin, hotly refuted Mrs. Dumont's charges. "Rich never beat Dorsey, and he never beat Eddie either," she said. "I'm telling you that right now, and when I die, I'll stand at the throne of judgment and look God right in the eye and tell him the same thing." Also, I never said this in the beginning. I've been trying to remember, and I always keep on forgetting. Just a little content warning, a little whatever it's called. Viewer discretion is advised. I know this chapter has to do with Mike, so we know that has to probably also do with Henry and Henry's bullying towards Mike, his his racist bullying towards him. So just reminding everyone, language, of course, a lot of violence, and of course, this chapter will probably deal with a lot of racism, typical to the 50s. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Back to this. From the Derry News, June 28th, 1958, page 2. This is in quotes. Daddy had to take me up 'cause I'm bad, Tot told nursery teacher before beating death. A local nursery school teacher who declined to be identified told a news reporter Art yesterday that young Dorsey Cochran came to his twice-weekly nursery school class with bad sprains of his right thumb and 3 fingers of his right hand less than a week before his death in a purported garage accident. It was hurting him enough so that the poor little guy couldn't color his Mr. Do safety poster, the teacher said. The fingers were swelled up like sausages. When I asked Dorsey what happened, he said that his stepfather Richard P. Macklin, had bent his fingers back because he had walked across a floor his mother had just washed and waxed. Daddy had to take me up because I'm bad, was the way he put it. I felt like crying, looking at his poor dear fingers. He really wanted to color his poster like the other children, so I gave him some baby aspirin and let him color while the others were having story time. He liked to color the Mr. Do posters. That was what he liked best. And I'm so glad I was able to help him have a little happiness that day. When he died, it never crossed my mind to think it was anything but an accident. I guess at first I thought he must have fallen because he couldn't grip very well with that hand. Now I think I just couldn't believe an adult could do such a thing to a little person. I know better now. I wish to God I didn't. Dorsey Cochran's older brother Edward 10 is still missing. From his cell in Derry County Jail, Richard Macklin continues to deny any part in either the death of his younger stepson or the disappearance of the older boy. From the Derry News, June 30th, 1958, page 5. You guys notice, too, that, these page numbers from the newspaper keep on going back and back, like the stories being forgotten about of the disappearance? Yeah. Macklin questioned in deaths of Grogan, Clements, produces unshakable alibis, source claims. From the Derry News, July 6, 1958, page 1, back on the cover. Macklin to be charged only with murder of stepson Dorsey, Borton says. Edward Cochran still missing. From the Derry News, July 24, 1958, page 1. Weeping stepfather confesses to bludgeon death of stepson. In a dramatic development in the district court trial of Richard Macklin for the murder of his stepson Dorsey Cochran, Macklin broke down under the stern cross-examination of County Attorney Bradley Whitson, and admitted he had beaten the 4-year-old boy to death with a recoilless hammer, which he had then buried in the far end of his wife's vegetable garden before taking the boy to Derry Hospital's emergency room. The courtroom was stunned and silent as the sobbing Macklin, who had previously admitted beating both of his stepsons occasionally if they had it coming for their own good, poured out his story. I don't know what came over me. I saw he was climbing on the damn ladder again, and I grabbed the hammer from the bench where it was laying, and I just started to use it on him. I didn't mean to kill him. With God as my witness, I never meant to kill him. Did he say anything to you before he passed out? Whitson asked. He said, Stop, Daddy, I'm sorry, I love you, Macklin replied. Did you stop? Eventually, Macklin said. He then began to weep in such hysterical manner that Judge Erhard Moulton declared the court in recess. From the Derry News, September 18th, 1958, page 16. Where is Edward Cochran? His stepfather, sentenced to a term of 2 to 10 years in Shawshank State Prison for the murder of his 4-year-old brother, Dorsey, continues to claim he has no idea where Edward Cochran is. His mother, who has just instituted divorce proceedings against Richard P. Macklin, says she thinks her soon-to-be ex-husband is lying. Is he? I, for one, really don't think so, says Father Ashley O'Brien, who serves the Catholic prisoners at Shawshank. Macklin began taking instruction in the Catholic faith shortly after beginning his prison term, and Father O'Brien has spent a good deal of time with him. He is sincerely sorry for what he has done, Father O'Brien goes on, adding that when he initially asked Macklin why he wanted to be a Catholic, Macklin replied, I hear they have an act of contrition, and I need to do a lot of that or else I'll go to hell when I die. He knows what he did to the younger boy, Father O'Brien said. If he also did something to the older one, he doesn't remember it. As far as Edward goes, he believes his hands are clean. How clean Macklin's hands are in the matter of his stepson Edward is a question which continues to trouble Derry residents, but he has been convincingly cleared of the other child murders which have taken place here. He was able to produce ironclad alibis for the first 3, and he was in jail when 7 others were committed in late June, July, and August. All 10 murders remain unsolved. In an exclusive interview with the News last week, Macklin again asserted that he knows nothing of Edward Cochran's whereabouts. I beat them both, he said in a painful monologue, which was often halted by bouts of weeping. I loved them, but I beat them. I don't know why, any more than I know why Monica let me, or why she covered up for me after Dorsey died. I guess I could have killed Eddie as easy as I did Dorsey, but I swear before God and Jesus and all the saints of heaven that I didn't. I know how it looks, but I didn't do it. I think he just ran away. If he did, that's one thing I got to thank God for. Asked if he is aware of any gaps in his memory, if he could have killed Edward and then blocked it out of his mind, Macklin replied, Ain't aware of any gaps. I know only too well what I did. I'd given my life to Christ, and I'm going to spend the rest of it trying to make up for it. From the Derry News, January 27th, 1960, page 1. 1960 now. Body not that of Cochran youth, Borton announces. Police Chief Richard Borton told reporters early today that the badly decomposed body of a boy about the age of Edward Cochran, who disappeared from his Derry home in June of 1958, is definitely not that of the missing youth. The body was found in Ainsford, Massachusetts, buried in a gravel pit. Both Maine and Massachusetts State Police at first theorized the body might have been that of the Cochran boy, believing that he might have been picked up by a child molester after running away from the Charter home where his younger brother had been beaten and killed. Dental charts showed conclusively that the body found in Ainsford was not that of the Cochran youth, who has now been missing for 19 months. From the Portland Press Herald, July 19, 1967, page 3. Convicted murderer commits suicide in Falmouth. Richard P. Macklin, who was convicted of the murder of his 4-year-old stepson 9 years ago, was found dead in his small third-floor Falmouth apartment late yesterday afternoon. The parolee, who had lived and worked quietly in Falmouth since his release in Shawshank State Prison in 1964, was an apparent suicide. The note he left indicates an extremely confused state of mind, Assistant Falmouth Police Chief Brandon K. Roche said. He refused to divulge the note's contents, but a police department source said it consisted of 2 sentences. I saw Eddie last night. He was dead. The Eddie referred to may well have been Macklin's stepson, brother of the boy Macklin was convicted of killing in 1958. It was the disappearance of Edward Cochran who eventually led to Macklin's conviction of the beating of Edward's younger brother Dorsey. The elder boy has been missing for 9 years. In a brief court proceeding in 1966, the boy's mother had her son declared legally dead so she could enter into possession of Edward Cochran's savings account. The account contained a sum of $16. He saw Eddie last night. He was dead. We know of another Eddie in the book. Maybe he saw the deadlights. I don't know. Making note of that, though. It's on page 258. 3. Eddie Cochran was dead all right. He died on the night of June 19th, and his stepfather had nothing at all to do with it. He died as Ben Hanscom sat at home watching TV with his mother, as Eddie Kaspark's mother anxiously felt Eddie's forehead for signs of her favorite ailment, phantom fever. As Beverly Marsh's stepfather, a gent who bore, in temperament at least, a remarkable resemblance to Eddie and Dorsey Cochran's stepfather, lifted a high-stepping kick into the girl's derriere and told her to get out there and dry those goddamn dishes like your mama told you. As Mike Hanley got yelled at by some high school boys, one of whom would some years later sire that fine upstanding young homophobe John Webby Garton, passing in an old Dodge while Mike pulled weeds out of the garden beside the small Hanlon home out in Witcham Road, not far from the farm owned by Henry Bowers' crazy father. As Richie Tozier was sneaking a look at the half-undressed girls and a copy of Jem he had found at the bottom of his father's socks and underwear drawer, getting a regular good boner, and as Bill Denbrough was throwing his dead brother's photograph album across the room in horrified unbelief. What about Stan? Although none of them would remember doing so later, all of them looked up at the exact moment Eddie Cochran had died, as if hearing some distant cry. Ooh, that's cool. The news had been absolutely right about one thing. Eddie's rank card was just bad enough to make him afraid to go home and face his stepdad. Also, his mother and the old man were fighting a lot this month. That made things even worse. When they got going at it hot and heavy, his mother shouted a lot of mostly incoherent accusations. His stepdad responded to these first with grunts, then yells to shut up, and finally with the enraged bellows of a boar which had gotten a quiver of porcupine needles in its snout. Eddie had never seen the old man use his fists on her, though, and he didn't think he quite dared. He saved his fists for Eddie and Dorsey in the old days. Now that Dorsey was dead, Eddie got his little brother's share as well as his own. These shouting matches came and went in cycles. They were most common at the end of the month when the bills came in. A policeman called by a neighbor might drop by once in a while when things were at their worst and tell them to tone it down. Usually that ended it. His mother was apt to give the cop the finger and dare him to take her in, but his stepdad rarely said boo. Can't talk. His stepdad was afraid of the cops, Eddie thought. He lay low during these periods of stress. It was wiser. If you didn't think so, just look at what happened to Dorsey. Eddie didn't know the specifics and did not want to, but he had an idea about Dorsey. He thought that Dorsey had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, the garage on the last day of the month. They told Eddie that Dorsey fell off the stepladder in the garage. If I told him once to stay off in it, I told him 60 times, his stepdad had said. But his mother wouldn't look at him except by accident, and when their eyes did meet, Eddie had seen a frightened, ratty little gleam in hers that he didn't like. The old man just sat there silently at the kitchen table with a quart of rain gold, looking at nothing from beneath his heavy lowering eyebrows. Eddie kept out of his reach. When his stepfather was bellowing, he was usually, but not always, but usually, all right. It was when he stopped that you had to be careful. 2 nights ago, he had thrown a chair at Eddie when Eddie got up to see what was on the other TV channel. Just picked up one of those tubular aluminum kitchen chairs, flipped it back over his head, and let it fly. It hit Eddie in the butt and knocked him over. His butt still ached, but he knew that it could have been worse. Could have been his head. Then there had been the night when the old man had suddenly gotten up and rubbed a handful of mashed potatoes into Eddie's hair for no reason at all. One day last September, Eddie had come in from school and foolishly allowed the screen door to slam shut behind him while his stepdad was taking a nap. Macklin came out of the bedroom in his billowy boxer shorts, hair standing up in corkscrews, cheeks grizzled with 2 days of weekend beard, breath grizzled with 2 days of weekend beer. There now, Eddie, he said. I got to take you up for slamming that fucking door. In Rich Macklin's lexicon, taking you up was a euphemism for beating the shit out of you, which is what he then did to Eddie. Eddie had lost consciousness when the old man threw him out into the front hall. His mother had mounted a pair of low coat hooks out there, especially for him and Dorsey to hang their coats on. These hooks had rammed hard steel fingers into Eddie's lower back, and that was when he passed out. When he came to 10 minutes later, he heard his mother yelling that she was going to take Eddie to the hospital, and he couldn't stop her. After what happened to Dorsey, his stepdad has responded. You want to go to jail, woman? That was the end of her talk about the hospital. She helped Eddie into his room, where he lay shivering on his bed, his forehead beaded with sweat. The only time he left his room during the next 3 days was when they were both gone. Then he would hobble slowly into the kitchen, groaning softly, to get his stepdad's whiskey from under the sink. A few nips dulled the pain. The pain was mostly gone by the 5th day, but he had pissed blood for almost 2 weeks, and the hammer wasn't in the garage anymore. What about that? What about that, friends and neighbors? Oh, the craftsman hammer, the ordinary hammer, was still there. It was the Scotty recoilless, I don't know, which was missing. His stepdad's special hammer, the one that he and Dorsey had been forbidden to touch. If one of you touches that baby, he told them the day he bought it, you'll both be wearing your guts for earmuffs. Dorsey had asked timidly if that hammer was very expensive. The old man told him he was damn tooting. He said it was filled with bell bearings and you couldn't make it bounce back up no matter how hard you brought it down. Now it was gone. Eddie's grades weren't the best because he had missed a lot of school since his mother's remarriage, but he was not a stupid boy by any means. He thought he knew what had happened to the Scotty recoilless hammer. He thought maybe his stepfather had used it on Dorsey and then buried it in the garden or maybe thrown it in the canal. It was the sort of thing that happened very frequently in horror comics Eddie read, the ones he kept on the top shelf of his closet. He walked closer to the canal, which rippled between its concrete sides like oiled silk. A swatch of moonlight glimmered across its dark surface in a boomerang shape. He sat down, swinging his sneakers idly against the concrete in an irregular tattoo. The last 6 weeks had been quite dry, and the water flowed past perhaps 9 feet below the worn soles of his sneakers. But if you looked closely at the canal sides, you could read the various levels to which it sometimes rose quite easily. The concrete was stained a dark brown just above the water's current level. This brown stain slowly faded to yellow, then to a color that was almost as white as at the level where the heels of Eddie's sneakers made contact when he swung them. The water flowed smoothly and silently out of the concrete arch that was cobbled on the inside, past the place where Eddie sat, and then down to the covered wooden footbridge between Bassey Park and Derry High School. The bridge's sides and plank footing, even the beams under the roof, were covered with intaglio, I don't know, with a lot of initials, phone numbers, and declarations. Declarations of love, declarations that so-and-so is willing to suck or blow, declarations that those discovered sucking or blowing would lose their foreskins or have their assholes plugged with hot tar, occasional eccentric declarations that defied definition. One that Eddie had puzzled over all this spring read, "Save Russian Jews, collect valuable prizes." What exactly did that mean? Anything? And did it matter? Eddie didn't go into the christening bridge tonight. He had no urge to cross over to the high school side. He thought he would probably sleep in the park, maybe in the dead leaves under the bandstand, but for now it was fine just to sit there. He liked it in the park and came often when he had to think. Sometimes there were people making out in the grooves of trees which dotted the park, but Eddie left them alone and they left him alone. He had heard lurid stories in the playground at school about the queers that cruised in Bassey Park after sundown. He accepted these stories without question, but he himself had never been bothered. The park was a peaceful place, and he thought the best of it was right there where he was sitting. He liked it in the middle of the summer when the water was so low it chuckled over the stones and actually broke up into isolated streamlets that twisted and turned and sometimes came out together again. He liked it in late March or early April, just after ice out, when he would sometimes stand by the canal, too cold to sit then, your ass would freeze, for an hour or two, the hood of his old parka, now 2 years too small for him, pulled up, his hands plunged into his pockets, unaware that his skinny body was shivering and shaking. The canal had a terrible, irresistible power in the week or two after the ice went out. He was fascinated by the way the water boiled whitely out of the cobbled arch and roared past him, bearing sticks and branches and all manner of human trash along with it. More than once he had envisioned walking beside the canal in March with his stepdad and giving the bastard a great big motherfucking push. He would scream and fall in, his arms pinwheeling for balance, and Eddie would stand on the concrete parapet and watch him carried off downstream, his head a black bobbing shape in the middle of an unruly white-capped current. He would stand there, yes, and he would cup his hands around his mouth and scream, "That was for Dorsey, you rotten cocksucker! When you get down to hell, tell the devil the last thing you ever heard was me telling you to pick on somebody your own size." It would never happen, of course, but it was an absolutely grand fantasy, a grand dream to dream as you sat here by the canal. A hand closed around Eddie's foot. He had been looking across the canal toward the school, smiling a sleepy but rather beautiful smile as he imagined his stepfather being carried off in the violent rip of the spring runoff, being carried out of his life forever. The soft yet strong grip startled him so much that he almost lost his balance and tumbled into the canal. "It's one of those queers the big kids are always talking about," he thought. Then he looked down. His mouth dropped open. Urine spilled hotly down his legs and stained his jeans black in the moonlight. It wasn't a queer. It was Dorsey. It was Dorsey as he had been buried. Dorsey in his blue blazer and gray pants, only now the blazer was in muddy tatters. Dorsey's shirt was yellow rags. Dorsey's pants clung wetly to his legs, as thin as broomsticks. And Dorsey's head was horribly slumped, as it had been caved in at the back and consequently pushed up in the front. Dorsey was grinning. "Eddie," his dead brother croaked, just like one of those dead people who were always coming back from the grave in one of those horror comics. Dorsey's grin widened. Yellow teeth gleamed, and somewhere, way back in that darkness, things seemed to be squirming. "Eddie, I came to see you, Eddie." Eddie tried to scream. Waves of gray shock rolled over him, and he had the curious sensation that he was floating. But it was not a dream. He was awake. The hand on his sneaker was as white as a trout's belly. His brother's bare feet clung somehow to the concrete. Something had bitten one of Dorsey's heels off. Come on down, Eddie. Eddie couldn't scream. His lungs didn't have enough air in them to manage a scream. He got out a curious, reedy, moaning sound. Anything louder seemed beyond him. That was all right. In a second or two his mind would snap, and after that nothing would matter. Dorsey's hand was small but implaceable. Eddie's buttocks were sliding over the concrete to the edge of the canal. Still making that reedy, moaning sound, he reached behind him and grabbed the concrete edging and yanked himself backward. He felt the hand slide away momentarily, heard an angry hiss, and had time to think. That's not Dorsey. I don't know what it is, but it's not Dorsey. Then adrenaline flooded his body. He was crawling away, trying to run even before he was on his feet, his breath coming in short, shrieky whistles. White hands appeared on the concrete lip of the canal. There was a wet slapping sound. Drops of water flew upward in the moonlight from dead, pallid skin. Now Dorsey's face appeared over the edge. Dim red sparks gleamed in his sunken eyes. His wet hair was plastered to his skull. Mud streaked his cheeks like war paint. Eddie's chest finally unlocked. He hitched in breath and turned it into a scream. Got to his feet and ran. He ran looking back over his shoulder, needing to see where Dorsey was, and as a result, he ran smack into a large elm tree. It felt as if someone, his old man for instance, had set off a dynamite charge in his left shoulders. Stars shot and corkscrewed through his head. He felt at the base of the tree as if poleaxed, blood trickling from his left temple. He swam in the waters of semi-consciousness for perhaps 90 seconds. Then he managed to gain his feet again. A groan escaped him as he tried to raise his left arm. It didn't want to come. It felt all numb and far away, so he raised his right and rubbed his fiercely aching head. Then he remembered why he had happened to run full tilt into the elm tree in the first place and looked around. There was the edge of the canal, white as bone and straight as string in the moonlight. No sign of the thing from the canal, if there ever had been a thing. He continued turning, working his way slowly through a complete 360 degrees. Bassey Park was silent and as still as a black and white photograph. Weeping willows draggled their thin, tenebrous arms, and anything could be standing slumped and insane within their shelter. Eddie began to walk, trying to look everywhere at once. His sprained shoulder throbbed in painful sync with his heartbeat. Eddie, the breeze moaned through the trees. Don't you want to see me, Eddie? He felt flabby corpse fingers caress the side of his neck. He whirled, his hands going up. As his feet tangled together and he fell, he saw that it had only been willow fronds moving in the breeze. He got up again. He wanted to run, but when he tried, another dynamite charge went off in his shoulder and he had to stop. He knew somehow that he should be getting over his fright by now, calling himself a stupid little baby who got spooked by a reflection. Maybe fell asleep without knowing it and had a bad dream. That wasn't happening, though. Quite the reverse. In fact, his heart was now beating so fast he could no longer distinguish his separate thuds, and he felt sure it would soon burst in terror. He couldn't run, but when he got out of the willows, he did manage a limping jog trot. He fixed his eyes on the street light that had marked the park's main gate. He headed in that direction, managing a little more speed, thinking, I'll make it to the light, and that's all right. I'll make it to the light, and that's all right. Bright light, no more fright. Up all night, what a sight. Something was following him. Eddie could hear it bulgioning, coming its way through the willow grove. If he turned, he would see it. It was gaining. He could hear its feet, a kind of shuffling, squelching stride, but he could not look back. No, he would look ahead at the light. The light was all right. He would just continue his flight to the light, and he was almost there, almost. The smell was what made him look back. The overwhelming smell, as if fish had been left to rot in a huge pile that had become carrion slushy in the summer heat. It was the smell of a dead ocean. It wasn't Dorsey after him now. It was the creature from the Black Lagoon. The thing's snout was long and pleated. Green fluid dripped from black gashes like vertical mouths in its cheeks. Its eyes were white and jelly-like. Its webbed fingers were tipped with claws like razors. Its respiration was bubbly and deep, the sound of a diver with a bad regulator. As it saw Eddie looking, its green-black lips wrinkled back from huge fangs in a dead and vacant smile. It shambled after him, dripping, and Eddie suddenly understood. It meant to take him back to the canal, to carry him down into the dark blackness of the canal's underground passage, to eat him there. Eddie put out a burst of speed. The Arxodium light at the gate drew closer. He could see its halo of bugs and moths. A truck went by, heading for Route 2, the driver working his way up through the gears, and across Eddie's desperate, terrified mind that he could be drinking coffee from a paper cup, listening to a Buddy Holly tune on the radio, completely unaware that less than 200 yards away, there was a boy who might be dead in another 20 seconds. The stink, the overwhelming stink of it, gaining all around him. It was a park bench he tripped over. Some kids had casually pushed it over early in the evening, heading toward their homes at a run to beat the curfew. Its seat poked an inch or two out of the grass, one shade of green on another, almost invisible in the moon-driven dark. The edge of the seat smacked Eddie in the shins, causing a burst of glassy, exquisite pain. His legs flipped out behind him, and he thumped into the grass. He looked behind him and saw the creature bearing down. Its white poached egg eyes were glittering, its scales dripping slime the color of seaweed, the gills up and down its bulging neck and cheeks opening and closing. "Ah!" Eddie croaked. Seemed to be the only noise he could make. "Ah! Ah! Ah!" He crawled now, fingers hooking deep into the turf. His tongue hung out. In the second before the creature's fish-smelling horny hands closed around his throat, a comforting thought came to him. This is a dream. It has to be. There's no real creature, no real black lagoon. And even if there was, it was in South America or the Florida Everglades or someplace like that. This is only a dream, and I'll wake up in my bed, maybe in the leaves under the bandstand, and the Batrachian. The hands closed around his neck, and Eddie's hoarse cries were choked off. As the creature turned him over, the chitinous hooks which sprouted from those hands scrawled bleeding marks like calligraphy into his neck. He stared into its glowing white eyes. He felt the webs between its fingers pressing against his throat like constricting bands of living seaweed. His terror-sharpened gaze noted the fin, something like a rooster's comb, and something like a hornpout's poisonous back fin, standing atop the creature's hunched and plaited head. And as its hands clamped tight, shutting off his air, he was able to see the way the white light from the Arxodium lamp turned a smoky green as it passed through the membranous head fin. "You're not real," Eddie choked. But clouds of grayness were closing in now, and he realized faintly that it was real enough, this creature, and it was, after all, killing him. And yet some rationality remained, even at the end, as the creature hooked its claws into the soft meat of his neck, as his carotid artery let go in a warm, painless gout that splashed the thing's reptilian plating. Eddie's hands groped at the creature's back, feeling for a zipper. They fell only when the creature tore his head from his shoulders with a low, satisfied grunt. And as Eddie's picture of what it was began to fade, it began promptly to change into something else. So Eddie Cochran's dead. Dang, that was intense. Wow. We have like 20 pages to go. Let's go. Let's do this. I think 20 pages. Am I doing math right? Yeah, 20 pages-ish. I'm ready. Let's do it. Four. Unable to sleep, plagued by bad dreams, a boy named Michael Hanlon rose soon after first light on the first full day of summer vacation. The light was pale, bundled up in a low, thick mist that would lift by 8 o'clock, taking the wraps off a perfect summer day. But that was for later. For now, the world was all gray and rose, as silent as a cat walking on a carpet. Mike, dressed in corduroys, a t-shirt, and black high-topped Keds, came downstairs, ate a bowl of Wheaties. He didn't really like Wheaties, but he had wanted the free prize in the box, a Captain Midnight magic decoder ring, then hopped on his bike and pedaled toward town, riding on the sidewalks because of the fog. The fog changed everything, made the most ordinary things like fire hydrants and stop signs into objects of mystery, things both strange and a trifle sinister. You could hear cats but not see them, and because of the fog's odd acoustic quality, you could not tell if they were far or near until you actually saw them come rolling out of the fog, with ghost halos of moisture ringing their headlamps. He turned right on Jackson Street, bypassing downtown, and then crossed the Main Street by way of Palmer Lane. And during his short ride down the little byway's 1 block length, he passed the house where he would live in as an adult. He did not look at it. It was just a small 2-story dwelling with a garage and a small lawn. It gave off no special vibration to the passing boy who would spend most of his adult life as its owner and only dweller. At Main Street, he turned right and rode up to Bassey Park, still wandering, simply riding and enjoying the stillness of the early day. Once inside the main gate, he dismounted his bike, pushed down the kickstand, and walked towards the canal. He was still, as far as he knew, impelled by nothing more than the purest whim. Certainly it did not occur to him to think that his dreams of the night before had anything to do with his current course. He did not even remember exactly what his dreams had been, only that one had followed another until he had awakened at 5 o'clock, sweaty but shivering, with the idea that he ought to eat a fast breakfast and then take a bike right into town. Here in Bassey there was a smell in the fog he didn't like, a sea smell, salty and old. He had smelled it before, of course. In the early morning fogs you could often smell the ocean in Derry, although the coast was 40 miles away. But the smell this morning seemed thicker, more vital, almost dangerous. Something caught his eye. He bent down and picked up a cheap, two-bladed pocketknife. Someone had scratched the initials EC on the side. Mike looked at it thoughtfully for a moment or two and then pocketed it. Finders keepers, losers weepers. He glanced around. Here, near where he had found the knife, was an overturned park bench. He righted it, setting its iron footings back to the holes they had made over a period of months or years. Beyond the bench he saw a matted place in the grass, and leading away from it, 2 grooves. The grass was springing back up, but those grooves were still faintly clear. They went in the direction of the canal, and there was blood. The bird, remember the bird, But he did not want to remember the bird, so he pushed the thought away. Dogfight, that's all. One of them must have hurt the other one pretty bad. It was the convincing thought by which he was somehow not convinced. Thoughts of the bird kept wanting to come back. The one he had seen in that Kitchener Ironworks, one Stan Uris would never have found in his bird book. Stan made it. It's like the first time he's been mentioned. Stop it. Just get out of here. But instead of getting out, he followed the grooves. As he did, he made up a little story in his mind. It was a murder story. Here's this kid, out late, out past curfew. The killer gets him. And how does he get rid of the body? Drags it to the canal and dumps it in, of course. Just like an Alfred Hitchcock Presents. Wow, he should have been the writer, not Bill. I'll stop with my commentary. The marks he was following could have been made by a dragging pair of shoes or sneakers, he supposed. Mike shivered and looked around uncertainly. The story was somehow a little too real. And suppose that it wasn't a man who did it, but a monster. Like out of a horror comic, or a horror book, or a horror movie, or a bad dream, or a fairy tale or something. He decided he didn't like the story. It was a stupid story. He tried to push it out of his mind, but it wouldn't go. So what? Let it stay. It was dumb. Riding into town this morning had been dumb. Following these 2 matted grooves in the grass was dumb. His dad would have a lot of chores for him to do around the place today. He ought to get back and start in, or when the hottest part of the afternoon rolled around, he would be in the barn loft pitching hay. Yes, he ought to get back. That's just what he was going to do. So you are, he thought. Want to bet? Instead of going back to his bike and getting on and riding home and starting his chores, he followed the grooves in the grass. There were more drops of drying blood here and there. Not much, though. Not as much as there had been right in that matted place back there by the park bench he had set to rights. Mike could hear the canal now, running quiet. A moment later he saw the concrete edge materialize out of the fog. Here was something else in the grass. My goodness, it's certainly your day for finding things, his mind said with dubious geniality. And then a gull screamed somewhere, and Mike flinched, thinking again of the bird he had seen that day just this spring. Whatever that is in the grass, I don't even want to look at it. And that was oh so very true, but here he was already bending over to it, hands planted just above his knees to see what it was. A tattered bit of cloth with a drop of blood on it. The eagle screamed again. Mike stared at the bloody scrap of the cloth and remembered what happened to him in the spring. So did the seagull bring him the cloth? No. No, the seagull didn't bring him the cloth. Okay, cool. 5. Each year during April and May, the Hanlon farm woke up from its winter doze. Mike would let himself know that spring had come again, not when the first crocuses showed under his mom's kitchen windows, or when kids started bringing amazing croakers to school, or even when the Washington Senators kicked off the baseball season, usually getting themselves shellacked in the process, but only when his father hollered for Mike to help him push their mongrel truck out of the barn. The front half was an old model of Ford car, the back end a pickup truck with a tailgate, which was the remainder of an old henhouse door. If the winter hadn't been too cold, the two of them could often get it going by pushing it down the driveway. The truck's cab had no doors, likewise there was no windshield. The seat was half of an old sofa that Will Hanlon had scrounged from the dairy dump. The stick shift ended in a glass doorknob. When they would push it down the driveway, sorry, oh my gosh, I need to focus. Almost there. 20 more pages. Now it's actually 20 more pages. Okay. If the winter hadn't been too cold, the two of them could often get it going by pushing it down the driveway. The truck's cab had no doors, likewise there was no windshield. The seat was half of an old sofa that Will Hannon had scrounged from the dairy dump. The stick shift ended in a glass doorknob. They would push it down the driveway, one on each side, and when it got rolling good, Will would jump in, turn on the switch. Ooh, that's not a good word. It's the R slur. Don't know why that's here, though. The spark. Step down on the clutch, punch the shift into first gear with his big hand clamped over the doorknob. Then he would holler, "Put me over the hump!" He popped the clutch, and the old Ford engine would cough, choke, jug, backfire, and sometimes actually start to run, rough at first, then smoothing out. Will would roar down the road toward Ruland Farms, turn around in their driveway. If he had gone the other way, Henry Bowers, his crazy father, Butch, probably would have blown his head off with a shotgun, and then roar back, the unmuffed engine blatting stridently, while Mike jumped up and down with excitement, cheering. His mom stood in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel and pretending a disgust she didn't really feel. Other times the truck wouldn't roll start, and Mike would have to wait until his father came back from the barn, carrying the crank and muttering under his breath. Mike was quite sure that some of the words so muttered were swears, and he would be a little frightened of his daddy then. It wasn't until much later, during one of those interminable visits to the hospital room where Will Hanlon lay dying, that he found out his father muttered because he was afraid of the crank, once it had kicked back viciously, flown out of the socket, and torn the open side of his mouth. "Stand back, Mikey," he would say, slipping the crank into its socket at the base of the radiator. And when the A was finally running, he'd say the next year he was going to trade it for a Chevrolet, but he never did. That old A Ford hybrid was still in the back of the home place, up to its axles and henhouse tailgate and weeds. When it was running, and Mike was sitting in the passenger seat, smelling hot oil and blue exhaust, excited by the keen breeze that washed in through the glassless hole where the windshield had once been, he would think, "Spring's here again. We're all waking up." And in his soul he would rise a silent cheer that shook the walls of that mostly cheerful room. He felt love for everything around him, and most of all for his dad, who would grin over at him and holler, "Hold on, Mikey! We're gonna wind this baby up. We're gonna make some birds run for cover." He would tear up the driveway, the A's rear wheels spinning back black dirt and gray clouds of clay, both of them bouncing up and down on the sofa seat inside the open cab, laughing like stark, natural-born fools. Will would run the A through the high grass and back field, which was kept for hay, toward either the south field, potatoes, and west field, corn and beans, or the east field, peas, squash, and pumpkins. As they went, birds would burst up out of the grass before the truck, squawking in terror. One partridge flew up, magnificent bird, brown as late autumn oaks, the explosive coughing whir of its wings inaudible even over the pounding engine. Those rides were Mike Hanlon's door into spring. The year's work had begun with a rock harvest. Every day for a week they would take the A out and load the bed with rocks which might break a harrow blade when the time came to turn the earth and plant. Sometimes the truck would get stuck under the mucky spring earth, and Will would mutter darkly under his breath. More swears, Mike surmised. He knew some of the words and expressions, others, such as son of a whore, puzzled him. He had come across the word in the Bible, and so far he could tell, a whore was a woman who came from a place called Babylon. Did I pronounce that right? Babylon? Babylon? I'll read the Bible. He'd once set out to ask his father, but the A had been in mud up through Recoil Springs, and there had been thunder clouds on his father's brow, and he had decided to wait for a better time. He ended up asking Richie Tozier later that year, and Richie told him his father told him a whore was a woman who got paid for having sex with men. What's having sex? Mike had asked, and Richie had wandered away holding his head. On one occasion, Mike had asked his father why, since they harvest rocks every April, there was always more of them the following April. They had been standing at the dumping off place near sunset on the last day of that year's rock harvest. A beaten dirt track, not quite serious enough to be called a road, led from the bottom of the west fields to the gully near the bank of the Kentucky. The gully was a jumbled wasteland of rocks that had been dragged off Will's land through the years. Looking down at the Badlands, which he had made first alone, and then with the help of his son, somewhere under the rocks he knew were the rotting remains of the stumps he had yanked out one at a time before any fields could be tilled. Will had lighted a cigarette and said, "My daddy used to tell me that God loves rocks, houseflies, weeds, and poor people above all rest of his creation, and that's why he made so many of them." God loved rocks, houseflies, weeds, and poor people above all the rest of his creations. That's why he made so many of them. But every year it's like they come back. Yeah, I think they do, Will said. That's the only way I know to explain it. A loon cried on the far side of the dusky in a dusky sunset that had turned the water a deep orange red. It was a lonely sound, so lonely that it made Mike's tired arms tighten with goose flesh. "I love you, Daddy," he said suddenly, feeling his love so strongly that tears stung his eyes. "Why, I love you too, Mikey," his father said, and hugged him tight in his strong arms. Mike felt the rough fabric of his father's flannel shirt against his cheek. "Now what do you say we go on back? We got just enough time to get a bath each before the good woman puts supper on the table." "Aya?" Mike said. "Aya yourself." "Aya?" Oh my gosh, I'm a mater. I don't know how to say it. Aya? 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 "Aya yourself," Will Hanlon said, and they both laughed, feeling tired but feeling good. Arms and legs worked but not overworked, their hands roughened but not hurting too bad. Spring's here, Mike thought that night, drowsing off in his room, while his mother and father watched the honeymooners in the other room. Spring's here again. Thank you, God. Thank you very much. And turning to sleep, sinking down, he heard the loon call again, the distance of its marshes blending into the desire of his dreams. Spring was a busy time, but it was a good time. I'm going to transfer over to my bed. See if it makes me a better reader. Short little intermission. Let's go. This book's heavy. Move my fanfiction I was writing. Alrighty. Following the rock harvest, Will would park the A in the high grass back of the house and drag the tractor out of the barn. There'd be harrowing then, his father driving the tractor, Mike either riding behind and along and holding on to the iron seat or walking alongside, come planting and following the planting, or walking alongside, picking up any rocks they had missed and throwing them aside. Then came planting, and following the planting came summer's work, hoeing. His mother would refurbish Larry, Moe, and Curly, their 3 scarecrows, and Mike would help his father put moose blowers on top of each straw-filled head. A moose blower was a can with both ends cut off. You tied a length of heavily waxed and rosined string tightly across the middle of the can, and when the wind blew through it, a wonderfully spooky sound resulted. A kind of whining croak. Crop-eating birds decided soon enough that Larry, Moe, and Curly were no threats, but the moose blowers always frightened them off. Starting in July, there was picking as well as hoeing. Peas and radishes first, and the lettuce and tomatoes that had been started in the shed boxes. Then the corn and beans in August. More corn and beans in September. Then the pumpkins and the squash. Somewhere in the midst of all that came the new potatoes, and then as the days shortened and the air sharpened, he and his dad would take in the moose blowers, and sometime during the winter they would disappear. It seemed they always made new ones each spring. The day after, Will would call Norman Sadler, who was as dumb as his son Moose, but infinitely more good-hearted. Normie would come over with his potato digger. For the next 3 weeks, all of them would hire. Oh no. For the next 3 weeks, all of them would work picking potatoes. In addition to the family, Will would hire 3 or 4 high school boys to help pick, paying them a quarter a barrel. The A Ford would cruise slowly up and down the roads of the south field, the biggest field, always in low gear, the tailgate down, the back filled with barrels, each marked with the name of the person picking into it. And at the end of the day, Will would open his creased wallet and pay each of the pickers cash money. Mike was paid, and so was his mother. That money was theirs. And Will Hanlon never asked either of them what they did with it. Mike had been given a 5% interest in the farm when he was 5 years old enough, Will had told him, to hold a hoe and tell the difference between witchgrass and pea plants. Each year he had been given another 1%, and each year, on the day after Thanksgiving, Will would compute the farm's profits and deduct Mike's share. Mike never saw any of that money, went into his college amount, and was to be touched under absolutely no circumstances. At last, the day would come when Normie Sadler drove his potato digger back home. By then, the air would have most likely turned gray and cold, and there would be frost and the drifts of orange pumpkins piled against the side of the barn. Mike would stand in the dooryard, his nose red, his dirty hands stuffed into his jeans pockets, and watch as his father drove first the tractor and then the A Ford back to the barn. He would think, "We're getting ready to go to sleep again. Spring vanished, summer gone, harvest time gone. All that was left now is the butt end of autumn, leafless trees, frozen ground, and lacing of ice along the banks of the Kenduskeag. In the fields, crows would sometimes land on the shoulders of Mo, Larry, and Curly, and stay as long as they liked. The scarecrows were voiceless, threatless. Mike would not exactly be dismayed by the thought of another year ending. At 9 and 10, he was still too young to make moral metaphors because there was plenty to look forward to. Sledding in McCarran Park or on Woodland Hill out there in Dairytown if you were brave, although that was mostly for big kids. Ice skating, snowball fights, snow fort building. There was time to think about snowshoeing out for a Christmas tree with his daddy, time to think about the Nordica downhill skis that he might or might not get for Christmas. Winter was good, but watching his father drive the A back to the barn, spring vanished, summer gone, harvest time done, always made him feel sad. The way the squadrons of birds heading south for the winters made him feel sad, or the way of the certain slant of the light could sometimes make him feel like crying for no good reason. We're getting ready to go to sleep again. It was not all chores. Oh my gosh, its connection to Pennywise. Now Pennywise hibernates over 27 years. Or hibernates for 27 years. Anyways. It was not all school and chores and school. Will Hanlon had told his wife more than once that a boy needed time to go fishing, even if it wasn't fishing he was really doing. When Mike came home to school, he first put his books on the TV in the parlor, second made himself some kind of snack. He was particularly partial to peanut butter and onion sandwiches, a taste that made his mother raise her hands in helpless horror. And third, studied the note his father had left him, telling Mike where Will was and what Mike's chores were. Certain rows to be weeded or picked, baskets to be carried, produce to be rotated, the barn to be swept, whatever. But on at least one school day a week, and sometimes 2, there would be no note. And on these days, Mike would go fishing, even if it wasn't really fishing he was doing. Those were great days. Days when he had no particular place to go and consequently felt no urge to get there in a hurry. Once in a while, his father left him another sort of note. No chores, one might say. Go over to Old Cape and look at the trolley tracks. Mike would go over to the Old Cape area, find the streets with the tracks still embedded in them, and inspect them closely, marveling to think of things like trains that had run right through the middle of the streets. That night, he and his father might talk about them, and his dad would show him pictures of his dairy album of the trolleys actually running. A funny pole went from the roof of the trolley up to the electrical wire, and there were cigarette ads on the side. Oh my gosh. Another time he had sent Mike to Memorial Park, where the standpipe was, to look at the bird bath, and once they had gone to the courthouse together to look at a terrible machine that Chief Bourne had found in the attic. The gadget was a tramp chair. It was cast iron, and there were manacles built into the arms and legs, rounded knobs that snuck out of the back and seat. It reminded Mike of a photograph he had seen in some book, a photograph of the electric chair and the Sing Sing. Chief Bourne let Mike sit in the tramp chair and try on the manacles. After the first ominous novelty of wearing the manacles wore off, Mike looked questioningly at his father and Chief Bourne, not sure why it was supposed to be such a horrible punishment for the bags, Bourne's word for them, that had drifted into town in the 20s and 30s. The knobs made the chair a little uncomfortable to sit in, sure, and the manacles on your wrists and ankles made it hard to shift into a more comfortable position, but... Well, you're just a kid, Chief Bourne said, laughing. What do you weigh? 70, 80 pounds? Most of the vags Sheriff Sully posted into the chair in the old days would go twice that. They'd feel a bit uncomfortable after an hour or so, really uncomfortable after 2 or 3, right bad after 4 or 5. After 7 or 8 hours, they stopped bleeding. Bleeding. And after 16 or 17, they stopped crying, mostly. By that time, their 24-hour tour was up. They'd be willing to sweat before God and that man the next time they came riding the roads up New England way. They'd give Derry a wide berth. I don't know. Stephen King writes the way that people talk. I don't know. As far as I know, most of them did. 24 hours in the tramp chair was a hell of a persuader. Suddenly there seemed to be more knobs in the chair, digging more deeply into his buttocks, spine, and small of his back, even the nape of his neck. Can I get out now, please? He asked politely, and Chief Bourne laughed again. There was a moment, one panicked instant of time, where Mike thought that Chief would only dangle the keys of the manacle in front of Mike's eyes and say, "Sure, I'll let you out when your 24 hours is up." "Why did you take me there, Daddy?" he asked on his way home. "You'll know when you're older," Willard replied. "You don't like Chief Bourne, do you?" "No," his father had replied in a voice so curt that Mike hadn't dared ask any more. But Mike enjoyed most of the places in Derry his father sent him or took him to. By the time Mike was 10, Derry succeeded in conveying his own interest in the layers of Derry's history to his son. Sometimes, as he had been trailing his fingers over the slightly pebbled surface on the sand in which the Memorial Park bird bath was set, or when he squatted down to look more closely at the trolley tracks which grooved Mott Street in the Old Cape, he would be struck by a profound sense of time as something real, as something that had unseen weight, the way sunlight was supposed to have weight. Some of the kids in school had laughed when Mrs. Greengus told them that, but Mike had been too stunned by the concept to laugh. His first thought had been, light has weight? Oh, my Lord, that's terrible. Time is something that would eventually bury him. The first note his father left him in the spring of 1958 was scribbled on the back of an envelope that held down with a salt shaker. The air was spring warm, wonderfully sweet, and his mother had opened all the windows. "No chores," the note read. "If you want to, ride your bike down to Pasture Road. You'll see a lot of tumbled masonry and old machinery out in the field on your left. Have a look around, bring back a souvenir. Don't go near the cellar hole, and be back before dark. You know why." Mike knew why, all right. He told his mother where he was going, and she frowned. "Why don't you see if Randy Robinson wants to go with you?" "Yeah, okay, I'll stop by and ask him," Mike said. He did, too. Randy had gone up to Bangor with his father to buy some seedling potatoes. So Mike rode his bike over to Pasture Road alone. It was a goodish ride, a little over 4 miles. Mike reckoned that it was 3 o'clock by the time he leaned his bike against an old wooden slat fence on the left side of the pasture road and climbed onto the field beyond. He would have maybe an hour to explore, and then he would have to start home again. Ordinarily. His mother would not be upset with him as long as he was back by 6 when she put dinner on the table. But one memorable episode had taught him that wasn't the case this year. On that one occasion we had been late for dinner, she had been nearly hysterical. She took after him with the dish rag, whooping him with it as he stood open-mouthed in the kitchen entryway, his wicker creel with the rainbow trout in it at his feet. "Don't you ever scare me like that," she had screamed. Don't you ever, 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 ever. Oh, ever, ever, ever. Each ever had been punctuated by another dish rag swat. Mike had expected his father to step in and put a stop to it, but his father hadn't done so. Perhaps he knew that if he did, she would turn her wildcat anger onto him as well. Mike had learned his lesson. One whooping with a dish rag was all it took. Home before dark. Yes, ma'am, righto. He walked across the field toward the Titanic ruins standing in the center. This was, of course, the remains of the Kitchener Iron Works. He had ridden past it, but never thought to actually explore it. He had never heard any kids saying that they had. Now, stooping to examine a few tumbled bricks that formed a rough cairn, I don't know that word, Cairn, he thought he could understand why. The field was dazzlingly bright, washed by sun from the spring sky. Occasionally, as a cloud passed before the sun, a great shudder of shadow would travel slowly across the field. But there was something spooky about it all the same, a brooding silence that was broken only by the wind. He felt like an explorer who had found the last remnants of some fabulous lost city. Up ahead and to the right, he saw the rounded side of the massive tidal cylinder rising out of the high field grass. He ran over to it. It was the ironworks' main smokestack. He peered into its bore and felt the fresh chill warm up his spine. It was big enough so he could have walked into it if he'd wanted. But he didn't want to. God knew what strange gunk there might be, clinging to the smoke-blackened inner tiles, or what nasty bugs or beasts might have taken up residence inside. The wind gusted. When it blew across the mouth of the fallen stack, it made a sound eerily like the sound of the wind vibrating the wax strings he and his dad put in the moose blowers every spring. He stepped back nervously, suddenly thinking about the movie he and his father had been watching last night on the early show. It had been called Rodan, and watching it seemed like great fun at the time, his father laughing and shouting, "Get that bird, Mikey!" every time Rodan made an appearance. Mike shooting with his finger until his mom popped her head in and told him to hush up before they gave her a headache with the noise. It didn't seem so funny now. In the movie, Rodan had been released from the bowels of the earth by the Japanese coal miners who had been digging the world's deepest tunnel. Looking into the black bore of this pipe, it was all too easy to imagine that bird crouched at the far end, leathery bat-like wings folded over its back, staring at the small, round boy face looking into the darkness. Staring with its gold-ringed eyes. Shivering, Mike pulled back. He walked always down the smokestack, which had sunken into the earth to half its circumference. The land rose slightly, and on impulse he scrambled his way up to the top. The stack was a lot less scary than the outside. Its tiled surface sun-warm. He got to his feet and strolled along, holding his arms out. The surface was really too wide for him to need to worry about falling off, but he was pretending he was a tight wire walker in the circus, liking the way the wind blew through his hair. At the far end, he jumped down and began to examine stuff. More bricks, twisted molds, hunks of wood, pieces of rusty machinery. Bring back a souvenir, his father note had said. He wanted a good one. He wandered closer to the mill's yawning cellar hood, looking at the debris, being careful not to cut himself on the broken glass. There was a lot of it around. Mike was not unmindful of the cellar hold his father's warning to stay out of it. Neither was he unminded of the death that had been dealt out on the spot 50-odd years before. He supposed that it was a haunted place in Derry, that if there was a haunted place in Derry, this was it. But either in spite of that or because of it, he was determined to stay until he found something really good to take back and show his father. He moved slowly and soberly toward the cellar hold, changing his course to parallel its ragged side when a warning voice inside whispered that he was getting too close, that a bank weakened by the hole where God only knew how sharp iron might be waiting to impale him like a bug, leaving him to die a rusty, twitching death. He picked up a window sash and tossed it aside. Here was a dipper big enough for a giant's table, its handle rippled and warped by some unimaginable flash of heat. Here was a piston too big for him to even budge, let alone lift. He stepped over and... What if I found a skull? He thought suddenly. The skull of one of those kids who were killed while they were hunting for chocolate Easter eggs back in 19 whatever it was. He looked around the sun-washed empty field, nastily shocked by the idea. The wind blew a low conch note. The wind blew a low conch note in his ears, and another shadow cruised silently across the field, like the shadow of a giant bird, or giant bat, or bird. He became aware all over again of how quiet it was here, and how strange the field looked, and its straggling piles of masonry, and its beached iron hulks, leaning this way and that. It was as if some sort of horrid battle had been fought here long ago. "Don't be such a dip," he replied uneasily to himself. They found everything. They found everything there was to find 50 years ago after it happened. And even if they didn't, some other kid or grown-up would have found the rest since then. Or do you think you're the only person who ever came here hunting for souvenirs? No, I didn't think that, but what? The rational side of his mind demanded. Mike thought it was still talking a little too loud, a little too fast. Even if there was something to find, it would have decayed long ago. So, what? Mike found a splintered desk drawer in the weeds. He glanced at it, tossed it aside, and moved a little closer to the cellar hold, where the stuff was thickest. Surely he would find something there. What if there are ghosts? That's but what. What if I see hands coming over the edge of the cellar hold, and what if they start to come up, kissing the remains of their Easter Sunday clothes that are all rotted and torn and marked with 50 years of spring mud and fall rain and caked winter snow, kids with no heads? He had heard at school that, after the explosion, a woman had found the head of one of the victims in a tree in her backyard. Kids with no legs, kids flayed open like codfish, kids just like me, who would maybe come down to play, down here where it's dark, under the leaning iron girders and the big old rusty cogs. Oh, stop it, for Lord's sake. But a shudder wrenched its way back his neck, and he decided it was time to take something, anything, and get the dickens out of there. He reached down almost at random and came up with a gear-toothed wheel about 7 inches in diameter. He had a pencil in his pocket, and he used it quickly to dig the dirt out of its teeth. Then he slipped the souvenir in his pocket. He would go now. He would go, yes. But his feet moved slowly in the wrong direction, toward the cellar hold, and he realized with a dismal sort of horror that he needed to look down inside. He had to see. He gripped a spongy support beam leaning out of the earth and swayed forward, trying to see down and inside. He couldn't quite do it. He had come to within 15 feet of the edge, but that was still a little too far to see the bottom of the cellar hold. I don't care if I see the bottom or not, I'm not going back now. I got my souvenir. I don't need to look down into any crummy old hole, and Daddy's note said to stay away from it. But the unhappy, almost feverish curiosity that had gripped him would not let go. He approached the cellar hold step by queasy step, aware that as soon as the wooden beam was out of his reach, there would be no more grab holes, also aware that the ground here was indeed squelchy and crumbly. In places along the edge, he could see depressions like graves that had fallen in, and knew that they were the sites of previous cave-ins. Heart thudding in his chest like the hard, measured strides of a soldier's boots, he reached the edges and looked down. Nested in the cellar hold, the bird looked up. Mike was not at first sure what he was seeing. All the nerves and pathways in his body seemed frozen, including those which conducted thoughts. It was not just the shock of seeing a monster bird, a bird whose breast was as orange as a robin's, and whose feathers were the unremarkable fluffy gray of a sparrow's feathers. Most of it was the shock of the utterly unexpected. He had expected monoliths and machinery half submerged in stagnant puddles and black mud. Instead, he was looking down to a giant nest which filled the cellar hold from end to end and side to side. It had been made out of enough timothy grass to make a dozen bales of hay, but this grass was silvery and old. The bird sat in the middle of it, its brightly ringed eyes as black as fresh, warm tar. For an insane moment before his paralysis broke, Mike could see himself reflected in each of them. Then the ground suddenly began to shift and run out from beneath his feet. He heard the tearing sound of shallow roots giving away, and he realized he was sliding. With a yell, he threw himself backward, pinwheeling his arms for balance. He lost it and thumped heavily to the littered ground. Some hard, dull chunk of metal pressed painfully into his back, and he had time to think of the tramp chair before he heard the whirring, explosive sound of the bird's wings. He scrambled to his knees, crawled, looked back over his shoulder, and saw it rising out of the cellar hold. Its scaly talons were a dusky orange. Its beating wings, each more than 10 feet across, blew the scraggy timothy grass this way and that, patternlessly, like the wind generated the helicopter rotors. I don't know. It uttered a buzzing, chirping scream. A few loose feathers slipped from its wings and spiraled back down to the cellar hold. Mike gained his feet again and began to run. He pounded across the field, not looking back now, afraid to look back. The bird did not look like Rodin, but he sensed it was the spirit of Rodin, risen from the cellar hold to the Kitchener Ironworks, like a horrible bird in the box. He stumbled, went to one knee, got up, and ran on. The weird chirping, buzzing screech came again. A shadow covered him, and when he looked up, he saw the thing. It had passed less than 5 feet over his head, its beak dirty yellow, open and closed, revealing a pink lining inside. It whirled back towards Mike. The wind oh my gosh. It's gonna be a rough few last pages, guys. It whirled back toward Mike. The wind it generated washed across his face, bringing a dry, unpleasant smell with it. Attic dust, dead antiques, rotting cushions. Let's see if this helps. He jigged to his left, and now he saw the fallen smokestack again. He sprinted for it, running all out, his arms pumping in short, jabbing strokes at his sides. The bird screamed, and he heard its fluttering wings. They sounded like sails. Something slammed into the back of his head. Warm fire traced its way up to the nape of his neck. He felt it spread as blood began to trickle down the back of his shirt collar. The bird whirled around him again, meaning to pick him up with its talons and carry him away like a hawk with a field mouse, meaning to carry him back to its nest, meaning to eat him. As it flew at him, swooping down, its black, horribly alive eyes fixed on him, Mike cut sharply right. The bird missed him, barely. The dust smell of its wings was overpowering, unbearable. Now he was running parallel to the fallen smokestack, its tiles blurring by. He could see where it ended. If he could reach the end and button hook to the left, get inside, he might be safe. He thought the bird was too big to squeeze inside. He came very closely to not making it. The bird flew at him again, pulling as it closed in, its wings flapping and pushing air in the hurricane. Its scaly talons, oh my gosh. Scaly talons now angled toward him and descending. It screamed again, and this time Mike thought he heard triumph in its voice. He lowered his head, put his arm up, and rammed straight forward. The talons closed, and for a moment the bird had him by the forearm. The grip was like a clutch of incredibly strong fingers, tipped with tough nails. They bit like teeth. The bird's flapping wings were thunder in his ears, and he was dimly aware of feathers falling around him, some brushing past his cheek like phantom kisses. The bird rose then, and for a moment Mike felt himself pulled upward, first straight and then on tiptoe, and for one freezing second he felt the toes of his keds lose contact with the earth. "Let me go!" he screamed at it, and twisted his arm. For a moment the talons held on, and the sleeve of his shirt ripped. He thumbed back down. The bird squalled. Mike ran again, brushing through the thing's tail fingers, gagging at that dry smell. It was like running through a shower curtain of feathers. Still coughing, eyes stinging from both tears and whatever vile dust coated the bird's feathers, he stumbled into the fallen smokestack. There was no thought now of what might be lurking inside. He went back perhaps 20 feet and then turned toward the bright circle of daylight. His chest was rising and falling in quick jerks. He was suddenly aware that if he had misjudged either the size of the bird or the size of the smokestack's muzzle, he had killed himself as surely as if he had put his father's shotgun to his head and pulled the trigger. There was no way out. It wasn't just a pipe. It was as blind. This wasn't just a pipe. It was a blind alley. The other side of the stack was buried in the earth. The bird squalled again, and suddenly the light of the end of the smokestack was blotted out as it lighted on the ground outside. He could see its yellow, scaly legs, each as thick as a man's calf. Then it cocked its head down and looked inside. Mike found himself again staring into those hideously bright, fresh tar eyes with their gold wedding rings of iris. The bird's beak opened and closed, and each time it snapped shut, he heard an audible click, like the sound you hear in your own ears when you snap your teeth together hard. Sharp, he thought. Its beak is sharp. I guess I knew birds had sharp beaks, but I never thought about it until now. It squawked again. The sound was so loud that the tile throat of the stack that Mike clapped his hands to his ears. The bird began to force itself into the mouths of the stack. No, Mike cried. No, you can't. The light faded as more of the bird's body pressed its way into the stack's bore. Oh my lord, why didn't I remember it was mostly feathers? Why didn't I remember I could squeeze? The light faded, was gone. Now there was only inky blackness. Now there was only inky blackness, a suffocating attic smell of the bird, and the rustling sound of its feathers. Mike fell on his knees and began to grope on the curved floor of the smokestack, his hands spread wide, feeling. He found a piece of broken tile, its sharp edges furred with what felt like moss. He cocked his arm back and pegged it. There was a thump. The bird uttered its buzzing, chirping sound again. Give me a second. I don't want to stop reading because we're in a climax of this part, and there are only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pages left. But also this is a mess. I want to actually read well. So I'm gonna see where we could stop next time, and then we could finish just those last 5 pages as well as these other ones. I think that 30 pages is the one we have to remember to aim for. Yeah, perfect right there. Would you guys hate it if we stop right now? There are 5 people on here right now. I think that we should stop right now because I can't read. And it's a problem. And I want you guys to actually be able to enjoy this. Enjoy what's going on. And understand what's going on. And not just have me rambling and falling asleep over here. I'm going to try and remember that 40 pages is too many. 30 pages is where it's at. We can only do 30 pages at a time or else I'll die. It'll take longer, but it'll at least be better. What's this in my book? Paper. Huh. Also during Thanksgiving break and stuff, I want to see if we could maybe do a reading every other night because I won't have school. I don't know if other people have school, but I won't, so I could at least read and then people can come back and read it. Yeah. When I read for too long, my eyes just can't do it, and then my mouth gets too tired and I can't say words properly. So I'm gonna have to say that I think that we're done for tonight. We got it through 30 pages, and that's how many we're gonna have to get through every single night. I have finally figured out. I hope you guys have a wonderful night. We will finish these last 5 pages next time. I think when I title this stream, though, I'm not going to title it Chapter 6, Part 2. I'm just going to say Chapter 7, Part 1. So, yeah. But yeah, I hope I see you guys there. It should be this Saturday at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm not going to forget this time. I promise you that. So, hope you have a great night. See you later. Bye.